Welcome, everyone, to Global Forum 2022. I'm James Derian, the director of the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Sydney. I want to thank you all for joining us for this second Global Forum on the Russian-Ukrainian War. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The University of Sydney was built on their ancestral lands, and we acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. Now, the Global Forum brings together international experts to explore the most pressing global issues in a critical and timely manner. They're designed as interim reports. We try to fill that space between the first media flashes of a major global event and then the academic analysis, or if you will, the long roll of thunder that follows. And we first conceived of the Global Forum in 2018 to deal with these pressing issues. And when we did conceive of them, we didn't think we'd be holding one on a major war in Europe. I don't think any experts thought that was highly likely in the near future. But here we are today, and we have some very special guests with us to help us make sense of the unthinkable. And I'm going to turn it over to Justin Hastings, who's our CISS research program lead for regional security. He organized this event, and he'll be hosting it on the theme of what does the Russo-Ukrainian War mean for Indo-Pacific security? Justin, the screen is yours.
Thanks, James. So let me just introduce the topic, and sort of then I'll introduce the esteemed panelists. I actually purposely scheduled this this forum several months after the start of the sort of the current iteration, I guess, of the Russia-Ukraine war, because I wanted us to move beyond sort of initial hot takes on the topic and think about the longer term implications of the Russia-Ukraine war for the Indo-Pacific, right, and countries within the Indo-Pacific. And you know, in some sense, this is sort of an indirect question, right? Because there's no combat in the Indo-Pacific. Certainly, the combat is far, far from countries like Australia. But what the war has done is, in some sense, it's forced countries in the Indo-Pacific to take sides or to find ways to not take sides, as the case may be. It's called into question the sort of, I guess, the peace-giving nature of the interconnectedness of supply chains, many of which come into the Indo-Pacific and leave it. And it's lifted a situation where Indo-Pacific countries are seeing sort of Russia fighting war with Ukraine, where even if Russia does ultimately accomplish its military aims, the question of whether it will be able to maintain its stable political aims is, I think, in the long term, is an open question. And so what we see is countries, in some sense, forced to react to this in the Indo-Pacific. China, for example, signed a partnership with Russia before the invasion, and that partnership has been tested, or at least called into question. India has long had a strategic partnership relationship with Russia, gets weapons, fertilizer, oil, and gas from Russia, and that has been called into question. Singapore has, in some sense, made changes to its foreign policy as a result of this. It's one of the few countries in Southeast Asia that has imposed sanctions on Russia, which is very unusual for an ASEAN country, right? And Japan has sort of, in some sense, joined the US in many respects to impose sanctions on Russia as well. What's interesting as well for the Indo-Pacific is that the primary means in which the West has dealt with Russia, economic sanctions unilaterally, but coordinated among a number of different countries, as well as arms transfers to Ukraine, have not been particularly common in the Indo-Pacific, right? In general, I think it's safe to say that the Asia-Pacific countries tend to not be comfortable with unilateral sanctions, and they generally tend to not be comfortable with dealing with sort of security issues outside of the region. Militarily, we also see, in some sense, and this is going to be an issue for military analysts in time to come, that sort of suggestions about where the offense-defense balance is, right? Is the offense-defense balance tipping? Do Russia's trials that they've seen in Ukraine indicate that, in some sense, the balance, at least in terms of anti-tank weapons, is tipping towards defense? And what does this mean for potential conflict situations in the Indo-Pacific? And so from here, we want to sort of move on to thinking about, well, sort of where do we go from here, right? So for Indo-Pacific countries, we move on from how do they respond to lessons they've learned, right? And sort of what they take away from this war. And so what I'm going to do to ask the panelists is to sort of think about the lessons that the countries that you're experts in, the lessons they may have learned as a result of the first 2 months of the conflict, of the progress of this conflict. So I'll introduce the panelists. The first one is Tong Zhao, who is a a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Beijing, and someone I've known for a number of years, back when he was a PhD student at Georgia Tech. And next we'll hear from Christy Govella, who is also a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund for the United States and the deputy director for the Asia program there. And sort of she did a PhD at Berkeley, at the same time as I did. And finally, we'll talk to Jingdong Yuan, who is an associate professor in the Government International Relations and CIS here at Sydney, and an expert in international security and specifically in Indo-China relations, as well as sort of alliance structures within the region. So first we'll turn to Tong to give your opinion. So you unmute. So Tong, what are some lessons learned that China has taken away from this? China is in I think a difficult position, but it's a position that in some sense is a position to take advantage of what's happening. And so I guess what lessons has China learned from the Russia-Ukraine war?
Thank you so much, Professor Hastings. I hope my connection is good, but in case my voice is breaking down, please do let me know. I think in order to understand the lessons China is learning, it's also important to note that there is a genuine perception gap between China and the Western countries. China has a fundamentally different understanding about the nature of the war. China is genuinely sympathetic to the Russian thinking. China feels that Russia was forced into this war to defend its legitimate security interests. And it's the NATO countries who are pursuing so-called expansionist or even hegemonic goals. And many Chinese experts genuinely believe it's the United States that benefits from the prolonging of the war. And Ukraine also allows itself to be used by the US and other Western countries. And after the war started, the Chinese mainstream view is actually an effort by the Western countries together to strangle Russia, to weaken Russia. The recent comment from US Secretary of Defense, I think, reinforces this Chinese reading and interpretation about the nature of the war. So that points to a more fundamental underlying problem, which is the long-standing information gap and perception gap between China and Western countries. Many Chinese experts, officials, genuinely believe in the Russian narratives, including the so-called US running of biolabs in Ukraine to produce biological weapons. They have, Chinese experts have real doubts about the Western narrative on civilian casualties in Ukraine. Those few Chinese experts who may know more on these issues also feel it is justified for China to exaggerate certain aspects of the facts. Because the mainstream view is the Western countries, they have long used misinformation to benefit their geopolitical interests. It's also important that the Chinese leadership, their personal policy preference plays a significant role in shaping Chinese overall thinking and narrative. Is clearly, it is driven from China's top leadership that China needs to preserve its special partnership with Russia, despite initial debates among the experts about how China should manage its relationship with Russia given the new situation. But the top leadership's clear preference to prioritize its partnership with Russia, I think, ends that debate to some extent. Even though China has the interest to use this opportunity to stabilize its relationship with Western countries, I think at practical level, that makes hard, the preference to prioritize relationship with Russia really limits how much China can achieve. But overall, I think this war reinforces China's concern about Western countries. It fears that in the future, in a showdown between China and the West, the Western countries can do the same thing to China. And the long-term lessons I think China is drawing, including on military and defense policy. China becomes even more. China has a firmer belief in building up its own national power. This power-centric mindset is strengthened as a result. And China feels that the Western countries are breaking all rules and principles. So rules and principles don't matter. China has to count on its own national material power. So that strengthens China's incentive to continue its military modernization. China also draws a lot of lessons about a future Taiwan conflict scenario, but I don't have time to go into the details. On geoeconomics, I think China feels it has to strengthen its self-reliance capability. So that has long-term implications for China's supply chain strategies, economic security. Geopolitically, I think China will continue its special partnership with Russia. China will have less interest to punish DPRK for its regional provocations. I think China's overall evaluation of the war will continue to change, but the main observations include, for example, US will be somewhat distracted from the Asia-Pacific region. The EU will emerge as a new pillar in a multipolar system, but the EU will also have less capacity to intervene in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan, Australia, they are viewed as belonging to the Western countries. They will be more unified with the US and other Western countries, European countries. But there are still a lot of so-called middle countries in the region, which are still fence-sitters and which China can influence. So the current Chinese diplomatic focus is more on these countries of global South. I think I'm going on for long enough. Maybe I should stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Very interesting. We can build on this sort of as we go on in the conversation. Let's sort of move on to Christy. So Christy, you're an expert in I guess Japanese politics as well as Asian security, and I'm wondering sort of what is Japan's lesson, sort of lesson learned from this, and in the long term, is Japan likely to change its overall defense strategy, its overall view of sort of how it deals with its self-defense in light of this war?
Thanks, Justin, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. So for Japan, I think there have been a number of lessons, most of which I think have underscored things that Japan has been thinking about for a while. Perhaps the first is just that it's been a clear reminder of that this kind of overt conflict is still possible. And so, of course, Japan was aware of this, but I think many people in Japan thought that there was a fairly remote possibility that we'd see an overt invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Most people have been much more focused on the gray zone conflict and other kinds of conflict short of war recently. So I think that, one lesson is just this very stark reminder that, war is not finished in the international order and that this is something that needs to be prepared for. And of course, Japan's mind goes to China as a potential parallel, and concerns there have been present for a long time, but have been heightened by this, although there are clear differences, between China and Russia and potential contingencies. I mean, I would say the second lesson is probably just driving home the idea for Japan that it really needs to support the international order. And this is something that Japan has been doing in recent years, for example, by trying to shore up the international economic order against threats from populism and protectionism. But, in the security order too, Japan sees, the rules and norms that it contains as being really essential for its national interests, and the Russian actions as clear threats to those. So that's part of the reason that, as you mentioned, we've seen Japan come out relatively strongly in support of sanctions and other kinds of actions by the US and Europe, which surprised many people who are, more familiar with seeing Japan take a much more reserved and hesitant response to aggression or to human rights violations. And, Japan really has not been a country that has taken to using sanctions, for example. So this threat to the international order and the importance of it as a deterrent and as a potential response to aggression is very much a lesson that Japan takes away. I would say third, it's really for Japan to underline the interconnections between Europe and Asia. Japan actually has been pushing Europe to become more involved in Asia for some time and has really welcomed the incorporation of Indo-Pacific policies and strategies into the EU and many European countries. For example, so this conflict and this war in Ukraine, really reinforces the idea for Japan that the two arenas are connected and that Japan really does need to form coalitions with like-minded partners outside of its traditional relationship with the US and Japan, of course, which is its real foundation of its security in the region. But these other broader coalitions are very important if it has any chance of responding to or deterring these kinds of actions in its own neighborhood as well. So I think with Japan's response, we see it really trying to send a signal to Europe with these actions and really hoping that, in the future, Europe will reciprocate in potential contingencies in the Indo-Pacific to the extent that it's able to. And we've seen Japan, meet with NATO and all kinds of other things that are kind of firsts for it, for example. I think a fourth thing is that, for Japan, again, with this kind of conflict in mind, it's a reminder that discussing and planning for potential contingencies in advance is essential. Many things in the US-Japan alliance have been discussed for some time. For example, the idea of a Taiwan contingency is not a new scenario, but some people who are not familiar with alliance planning may be surprised to hear that a lot of the concrete details of what would happen in such contingencies are not necessarily as hammered out as people might think, that there is a lot of concrete preparation that can and probably needs to be done sooner rather than later if they hope to actually have a concrete response in a potential contingency in Taiwan or elsewhere, or to the Senkakus or anywhere that they perceive a threat. Because really what we've seen in this particular scenario is that once a conflict begins, you really don't have time to take on any new initiatives. Really, you have to work with what you have. So if you've prepared and you've trained or tried to enhance your interoperability, that's really an asset. So it's really for Japan emphasize the importance of strengthening the US-Japan alliance, which has really been in progress already, but it underscores that. And as you alluded to, it has prompted debates at home about whether Japan should spend more for its national defense, some suggestions that Japan should engage in nuclear sharing. I think that we can talk more about it if folks are interested in the Q&A, but I think that we are not likely to see a sea change in Japanese security policy, but many key questions that are being discussed, for example, should Japan acquire ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, to have a longer strike capability, strike range, then, and also these other questions that have been discussed for some time will come up again and will have new context and new meaning in light of this conflict. And Japan is revising its national security strategy this year, so undoubtedly we'll see some impacts there. And then finally, just to touch on the economic lessons, perhaps, I think it's clear, as again has been clear for some time in the region, that economic interdependence is both a source of vulnerability and a source of leverage, depending on who you are. And Japan has long been concerned with economic security, economic coercion, for example, in the region. In this case, Japan actually has relatively limited economic interdependence with Russia. So I think that's also part of the story about why Japan has been more willing to act, because Japan is not very strongly tied to Russia relatively, and it does have some energy imports, but not nearly to the extent that Europe does, for example. Of course, this is a very different story with China if we were trying to draw those parallels where, Japan and China are very strongly interdependent. And I think that's something to keep in mind. But, in terms of lessons, Japan is certainly looking at trying to even more so think about its economic security and limit, engagements or heavy dependence with countries or trade partners who are of, questionable trustworthiness. And so, there have been discussions of how Japanese companies are not necessarily withdrawing from some of the big energy projects like Sakhalin 2, for example. But I think what we will see is that in the future, you don't see as many new investments. And of course, companies are learning from this all the time. Governments are as well. And so it doesn't seem likely that we'll see, for example, a return to Japan's previous policy under Prime Minister Abe of trying to reconcile with Russia, trying to encourage investment. That really does seem to be done. And, I think that this story of dependence and trying to construct economic relationships positively is, again, like the other things I mentioned, something that Japan has been thinking about for some time, but it certainly gives it new context thinking about Russia and looking at also the really complicated impacts of sanctions. So it's not just Japan's dependence on Russia, but it's also how the whole global economic system is impacted by this conflict, which then still affects Japan, even if its direct dependence is less than some other countries. So I'd say those are some of the general lessons that Japan has drawn so far. But as you've noted, it's an evolving situation. I think a lot remains to be seen. And so, some of the final takeaways are yet to be decided by people who are watching this very closely in Japan.
Great, thanks very much. JD, why don't we turn to you? And I'm interested basically in in India in particular, which you studied. Sort of, India's now have this really sort of like awkward position that it's in, right? And I guess the question is India likely to change its strategy? Is it likely to? I mean, what do you think it's likely to do, and what lessons is it taking away from the Russia-Ukraine war, and specifically the response to it by the West and by other countries?
Right. Thanks, Justin. I think India, to some extent, like China, has been put into a very sort of awkward position. And of course, India does not have as a clear-cut, or at least on surface, a very close sort of a strategic partnership with Russia, like China has. Still, India, if you think back in the Soviet era, and India has maintained for a very long time close relationship in terms of the military aspect, weapons procurement. And in recent years, of course, energy dependence, or in that area, India has also formed a very close relationship with Russia. And so far, India has basically framed its position in a way that it shows sort of a neutrality, but implicitly is expressing some unhappiness or uneasiness with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but not in a public fashion. And so if you look at India's voting record and in Security Council or General Assembly or Human Rights Council, India has abstained, from all these votes. And in China's case, China has abstained in most cases, but has come out in line with Russia on a number of occasions. But I think it's for India, if this continues, if the demand for sanction, and in particular the secondary sanctions, for instance, the US would be imposing on Indian companies, or the fact that India continues to do business with Russia, and that could raise some concern. And also in Washington, I think that this is obviously an issue there, because for some time people have commented that the if we're talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, the free and open strategy, and the Quad, the weakest link seem to be in India, because India seemed to be tagging along with the principle, supporting rule-based order, and clearly with China in mind. Beyond that, I think India is very conscious of its kind of a unique national interest, so it's dealing each case on its own merits. So that is reflected in India's reaction to the or the lesson drawn from this incident. But I'd like to go a little bit maybe broader in the regions you discussed earlier about the implication for the Indo-Pacific. So I think there are clearly several of them. One is with the Biden administration. Clearly, this current administration has taken a different path to consultation with the allies and coordinating policies with allies. So I think the Ukraine crisis certainly strengthened that part of the cross-Atlantic relationship, but also galvanizing sort of close allies in the region, Australia and Japan, in that regard. So in that sense, the lesson would be, the alliances are still an important part of the overall sort of U.S. global security architectural approaches. So that's maybe a positive outcome in that regard. But then there are other considerations. For instance, before the Ukraine crisis and for the last 2 years, I think the European Union was actively developing a Indo-Pacific strategy. So they want to be more engaged, like Germany or France, even UK. There's a global Britain, idea. So they all recognize the geo-economic importance of the region, and then so they want to be more actively involved, understanding that China's challenges should not be weighted, and so they have to preempt in some way and coordinating and working with the allies in the region. But now we have this crisis, their attention and their focus and their resources seem to be, so there might be a pause on their Indo-Pacific aspirations, and certainly in reality, they have to deal with a lot of issues, supporting Ukraine, but also how to implement sanctions, because that's relatively straightforward for the U.S. to say, to sanction Russia, in particular, asking the Europeans to cut off energy ties. So in terms of crude oil, maybe that's doable if there's supply in the international market, but to replace the natural gas, it would be very tough. A lot of infrastructure issues there. So the Europeans will have to think about what they can, how far they can go. I mean, in imposing remain unity, in imposing sanctions and the supply weapons, and so I would say the lessons would be mixed for the Indo-Pacific. So the openings in the previous few years and now seem to be, if not closed, and certainly not opening wider anymore. So there's a pause there. So I'll stop here.
Great, thanks very much. So now that we've had our initial says, I should say that for people listening, if you want to write questions in the chat, I can read them and collect them, and we can start asking them of the panelists. So feel free to write those anytime. One sort of, I guess, more specific question I want to pick up on that sort of, I think Christy sort of brought out the most was this idea of economic interdependence, right? And so what we've seen is sort of the response of the US and Europe in particular to Russia was essentially to weaponize economic interdependence, right? And sort of in some sense, this is actually an ongoing problem for the world over the past couple of years, right? I mean, global supply chains have, sort of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is causing issues with global supply chains and showing how difficult it is to unravel them in some ways, if you actually want to do that. But, because of COVID, for example, and because of other sort of kinds of shocks, we've seen the global supply chain has been, in general, sort of put under strain, right, over the past couple of years. And this has caused, starting to be causing security problems for many countries. And so, we see sort of this economic interdependence being weaponized by the US, as political scientists, we say the natural reaction against a unilateral sanction is to essentially find a third party who will then go around that sanction, right? And the way the U.S. tries to get around this is by essentially weaponizing the use of the U.S. dollars as the basis for international trade, right? And so one question we would have then for countries in the Indo-Pacific is they see this weaponization of economic interdependence, and they see sort of essentially the use of supply chain as a means of punishing countries. I mean, how do they respond to that, right? What does that mean for how they think strategically, specifically about, as Christy said, sort of safeguarding their economic security? Right? I'm interested especially in sort of China's response to this, right? I mean, China is thinking about sort of the use of the dollar and sort of the vulnerabilities that causes on international trade, as well as its vulnerability to, relying on exports to countries that may cut it off. And so sort of when I ask Tong, sort of the first more specific question, sort of how is China going to think about this strategically as they sort of think about sort of the economic interdependence consequences of the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
I think strategically, China faces a dilemma because on the one hand, China understands that in order to secure its long-term economic growth, which is so important to China's development of its comprehensive national power and to secure China's political security, etc., China has to maintain its access to Western technologies, investments, markets, etc., China cannot allow decoupling. But on the other hand, as you said, China concludes that the weaponization of economic interdependence is a grave threat, and in the Western countries can use the same weaponized, economic relationship in the future to, squeeze China in a crisis, and China simply cannot allow itself being vulnerable to the Western economic pressure, which can lead to, even political problems domestically. So especially the top leadership, President Xi, he also has a personal inclination that China has to be self-reliant in the key economic and technological areas. He has been stressing the importance of this for many years before the Ukraine war. And the war only strengthens this belief across the bureaucracy. The emphasis on the importance to build China's autarky capacity and self-reliant capacity in key areas is growing as a result. But the consequence is, if China is taking measures to build up its long-term self-reliance, that would make Western countries unilaterally vulnerable to China. And certainly that would motivate Western countries, to reduce interdependence, and that could encourage economic decoupling, which China wants to avoid. So this tension between these two aspects in China's strategic geoeconomic thinking hasn't been, I think, fully addressed in Chinese expert community. In fact, I think the policymaking is more driven by, ad hoc response to, to recent developments, especially when experts feel there is a political pressure, especially if the leadership is viewed as stressing the importance of self-reliance. Then, experts propose a lot of measures to strengthen this aspect, without discussing too much for their long-term implications for China's goal to avoid decoupling. We have seen China, taking measures to promote the globalization of China's own currency, the Chinese yuan, to reduce the importance of US dollar in global markets. China is using Chinese yuan to its oil trade with Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. And China believes that over time, this war will reduce the dominance of US financial power internationally, and will promote the de-dollarization of the international financial system.
Thanks. Christy and JD, I think, one of the questions that, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this as well. Sort of one of the issues in some sense with weaponizing economic interdependence is that it's kind of a one and done deal, right? Sort of once the countries decouple, what do you do after that? I guess the question we would have is, China may be able to move towards a form of autarky because it's such a large country, but many other countries in the Indo-Pacific aren't necessarily, so I wouldn't say invulnerable, but so many other countries are much more vulnerable to this kind of pressure than China may be. And so sort of what's your take on this topic as well?
I can probably just jump in briefly.
Right.
So in terms of Japan reducing its dependence or vulnerability economically, this is something that Japan has really been thinking about for quite some time, specifically with respect to China since really the mid-2000s, especially after 2010, when there was an incident around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands that led to a ban on the export of rare earths from China, which were very essential to various Japanese supply chains. So, Japan, for example, in that case, has had some success in reducing its dependence. And as you say, economic coercion is sort of one of these things where you can use this tool, but then others learn, others adapt. And so, when China did this to Japan, Japan tried to change. It still is, dependent on China for these rare earths, but much less so. It's decreased from like 90-something% dependence at various parts of the supply chain for rare earths to like 60%, which is a big change. But the problem is also that it's very hard to do this across all areas. And, Japan, despite putting forward these efforts, has not really succeeded in convincing Japanese companies, not to invest in China. They've tried to convince them to pursue a China +1 strategy where they, don't put all their eggs in the China basket. But Japanese companies, when surveyed, even today, despite all of the things that have happened with economic coercion and unfair trade practices, IP theft, et cetera, they still rate China as a very desirable place to invest. And so, I think with Japan, it's interesting because you can see kind of where you can be successful, but you also see the limitations and the interconnections between the private sector and the government, and how, the private sector really has to buy into this, and they don't necessarily always see things the same way that the government does. So obviously in the region right now, even prior to the Ukraine crisis, as you said, people were thinking about supply chains, and a lot of the conversations around supply chain resilience that are happening between the US and Japan bilaterally in the Quad, et cetera, are all about trying to reduce the heavy dependency of supply chains, particularly in China, but also in other vulnerable areas. And I think all of those efforts are well-intentioned, but I think it's also recognized that it's going to be pretty difficult and a very slow process. So I think, to answer your question, I think this crisis in Ukraine really underscores that, but it also, doesn't necessarily change the fundamental complexity and difficulty. And since countries are constantly adapting, it's even more difficult, because in some cases you want to maintain leverage over others perhaps, but it's also a two-way street. So having leverage means that, if you sanction somebody, it also hurts more if you're very dependent. So there's all kinds of complexities to this economic side that really make the security calculations more complicated in, somewhat unpredictable ways sometimes.
JD?
I would agree to that. It is easy to talk about decoupling or de-globalization, but the globalization is a vast network of supply chains or economic interdependence that have been built up over the last maybe, I don't know, if we talk about the multinational corporations starting in the early 1960s. So we have over half a century of this, continuing the expansion of this network of supply chains and the markets, production sites and raw materials intermediaries. So there are all the chips in now these days. Any final products would rely on all these different sources, different parts of the production of components and design and marketing and all of that. So they are in a sort of an integrated whole. So now you try to use that and then to see if you can switch the light and on and off. And if I'm not happy with the country, I can just switch off the light. But you can't do that. And for the U.S. government, certainly it would be much difficult because you can't dictate the private sector to certain, unless you raise it to the national security. You have to justify certain extreme situation. Even if these private companies come along, and then it will take time to rework out the supply chains and to reorganize. Because what China today occupies, I think because the world has been working in that way for the last 30 years, it is the only single country that has the complete list of everything available, or even in terms of human capitals, technicians and people who can quickly, receive order and then to deliver. No other countries, without putting, infrastructure and investing heavily, cannot just replace China. And if you see reason China's sort of this zero tolerance of a COVID case, many major cities closed down, locked down, and then the ports will not operate. That already been, even we're not talking about sanction or other security related, just a matter of dealing with the pandemic. The way China is doing that already affects many different businesses in many parts of of the world. And Europe is another example, for European countries to get off energy reliance on Russia and say, let's do renewable or nuclear energy. I mean, renewables can't meet all the requirements, and nuclear takes decades and billions and tens of billions of dollars to construct nuclear power plants. So we're looking down 10, 15 years if we start today, and then we probably won't get a satisfactory reworking of another kind of a globalization or kind of a deglobalization, I don't know, 3.0 in that regard. It will take a lot of time there. And then finally, about replacement of the dollar, de-dollarization. I think, today, of course, the dollar accounts for 2/3 of the transaction in international trade, even though the US only trades maybe under 10% of the global total. But the US dollar just play that enormous role. And you can talk about the other currencies. Unless all the players, I see this more as a bilateral deal, say China, renminbi. It's only bilateral, the two parties are agreed to swap or accepting each other's currency. But it's difficult to see, the Chinese currency suddenly to become a global reserve currency to replace the US dollars, as long as China is not willing to make it a convertible, and even among the new kind of partners or new kind of communities of using Chinese renminbi.
Thanks. So we have a first question from the audience. So the question is, would it be fair to say the outcome of the Ukraine war will shape the global order of the future? And I guess, this is a very general question. So we might say, well, okay, so, in some sense, does it matter who wins this war for the Indo-Pacific? Or is it looking like a war where there may be no sort of clear winner? But, sort of in some sense, sort of what are going to be the implications for the order itself or the global order from the Ukraine war, and how are Indo-Pacific countries likely to see that? Or is this in some sense not really a challenge to the order at all?
Let me just take a stab. I think first it depends on what we can define this order. What is current order, right? So, but clearly, if the war protracted, continues, I think it will continue for some time to come, and there's no easy win for Russia, and so there's going to be a attrition, for some time. But what will happen is we'll make a clearer delineation between sort of on the one hand Russia or whoever who are sympathetic or do not want to openly criticize Russia, and then maybe the U.S. let the sort of I would say is the original liberal international order, because the liberal international order has always been part of the Western world rather than the whole world. So the order has not covered the entire world. So I think what this war does is basically to create this clearer delineation of certainly the U.S.-led camps, and then the rest of maybe some Russia sympathetic country group, and then countries in the middle. So that would be what may happen in this context.
I think this certainly strengthens Chinese resolve to more actively shape international order to its favor. This reinforces Chinese belief that the international order, the current international order dominated by Western countries, is unfair and cannot sustain any longer. Russia was forced to even use violence to defend its legitimate interests and to correct, the so-called problems in the current international order. And I think that encouraged China to think along the similar way. And if we look at the results, Russia is not necessarily losing, right? It's despite united Western efforts to strangulate Russia from the Chinese mainstream perspective, Russian economy is still relatively stable. Russian people's expectation about their future is still relatively positive. The international community is not entirely on the Western side. There is still a large number of countries in the middle that China and Russia, like many countries, can try to influence. So I think all these makes China, more publicly and explicitly challenge the Western dominant order. We have seen this from very senior Chinese official statements, etc. So I don't know how this will influence the future global order, but it certainly will make the competition to shape the order much more intense.
Just to jump in and echo a couple of points that have been said. I mean, it's a very big question, but I guess, at various levels, if we're talking about the order at the highest level, then this is certainly a test, as others have alluded to, of the rules and norms of the existing order. Will they maintain, can they be really enforced? Do they have a deterrent effect? And so I think, this is going to shape it in the sense that it will be a test that will inform people's willingness to abide by these rules and norms in the future. And then at the level of interest, national interests and alignments, I think that, for the most part, I think we've seen, pretty predictable alignments with who is sort of supporting, the Western side and who is more on the Russian side, with some, surprises and degrees. For example, I was mentioning the stronger response of Japan than some expected. Germany has had a very strong response to this, perhaps more so than many people would have expected. And so I think that in some cases, this will probably, for countries that are maybe in flux, will push them in a direction more strongly now. And then I think the other part that's hard to say is that I think that really the two theaters, the Indo-Pacific and Europe, are connected very concretely through the relationship between China and Russia. And I think that this conflict is going to, for example, increase Russian dependency on China in various ways, economically and otherwise, that will have effects in both theaters and will probably also impact the international order in ways that are more complicated than just a simple alignment. But because these factors are actually connected, I think that that's something that we'll see have an impact. And I do think that there's a lot of discussion about whether countries will be distracted in Europe and not pay attention to the Indo-Pacific. But I think the one thing that keeps policymakers, for example, in the US very attuned to the Indo-Pacific is this conversation about China and Russia and, this worry about the order more broadly and the interconnections therein. So I think there will be an impact and this will shape it, but some of the processes, I guess, are more like micro and then some are at the highest levels.
Justin, if I could,
yeah,
just briefly as a comment, but also maybe provoke, when people talk about international order, they often look to it in terms of, stability, assurances that, that the supply chains will be secure, that there will be less likelihood of war. But there are obviously some nation states now that see the international order as I think JD said, favoring certain countries or even blocs, be it the Western bloc, EU and the United States. Is there the possibility that the new world order, to the extent there will be any order to it, be more like a disorder, will be the revanchist states, the states that felt like they haven't benefited? I mean, the long tirade and speechifying by Putin on this has been, of course, that Russia gave up way too much at the end of the Cold War. And that China never was really fully recognized as a superpower, and that there are other revanchist powers out there. Perhaps even India could join those ranks. So I'm just curious as to whether you see the potential here for global disorder, and leading this way would be those parties felt that they don't have benefits coming from this order. And in that case, then we're historical analogies are always false at one level, but something resembling pre-World War II here, where that's the new alliance. Do any of our panelists want to comment on that, or is this just simply a misapprehension on my part and some others?
I'll just chime in briefly because I think you raised a really good point about the aftermath of conflict, and it's something that people aren't thinking about necessarily as actively right now. But other folks at my institution who specialize in Europe have, been thinking about what a post-conflict resolution or peace agreement looks like, and how Russia would be involved in that, and what kind of buy-in you need from folks who are considered to be aggressors, because creating these types of long-standing disagreements out of conflict has been the root of conflicts to come. And I think in these discussions, it's just really clear how complex this is and how difficult it will be, no matter what happens in the future, that this is just going to be something that is a potential source of further disorder in the future, even if it's resolved seemingly in the moment, if it's not done correctly. So I guess I would just echo that point and say that, I think we're only now just kind of hinting at what the ripple effects of this will be in the future.
Yeah, I'll be happy to share my understanding of the mainstream Chinese view. I don't think China is driven by a perceived self-desire to benefit more from a new order. China feels that, a regional order was working, especially the international economic order. China certainly has benefited greatly from that. But it's exactly because of China's success. It's that China's relative rise is increasingly challenging the U.S. and Western dominance in the international system. So it is a structural change in the international balance of powers that is making Western countries increasingly uneasy about this trend line. So they are making efforts to change things, change roles, change principles, or to bend roles to benefit their interest. So it is forced upon China. And for rising power, I think the mainstream view here is, for rising power, it may be increasingly necessary to actively shape international order, by taking decisive moves. And secondly, I think there is this feel that, in addition to the structural factor driving this, Western countries, they also have something in their strategic culture that is inherently hegemonic and inherently biased against different political systems. And therefore, China has an increasingly cynical reading about the Western-dominated rules and norms. And I think that makes China feel that in order to improve the international order dominated by Western rules and norms, China has to focus on its power, right? It is the accumulation of power that ultimately decide future order. I don't think China has a good grand strategy about how to shape international order in the future. But the thinking is, we need to set up we need to shape the order in our favor. So the priority is to build our power first. And after our power is, clearly, in place, then, the right order will fall in place too. So that's, I think, driven a lot of efforts focusing on power building rather than how to design or to revise and improve the current order so that China's interests can be better served.
Okay, thanks. I guess one last question, we only have a couple more minutes, that I'm interested in is, I guess, the issue of what this means militarily for the Asia-Pacific. So one thing that I think caught many people off guard about the sort of the Russia-Ukraine war is that if you were to look across the world and say, well, where is a large-scale conventional war likely to happen? In the world, it wouldn't have been Europe. It would have been actually Asia, right? Because there's many sort of potential hot points there. So the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, South China Sea, and the India-China border, right? And so I guess the question we would have is, well, what lessons are there from the course of the war for how the war was fought? Because this is the first major conventional land war in a while in the world. What are some lessons that sort of Indo-Pacific countries would take away from military contingencies in Asia, from sort of how the Russia-Ukraine war is actually being fought in Taiwan, Korea, wherever?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, of course, sufficient allocation to defense will be quite important. Procurement of weapon system. But increasingly, if you look at the current crisis and how, Ukraine obviously is inferior in all aspects in military term, of course, with the Western support. is getting some of these strengths there. So I would think a coordination, intelligence, and sort of what you call the network of warfare, and how you deploy the forces at certain critical points, and then to deliver strikes, and how you protect your core sort of defense capabilities. So it's in one way is you need a lot of expenditure and equipment, and for that, Asia has been far away the part of the world that spends a lot, $500 billion US dollars in 2021, and so that's quite a large proportion, 2% of GDP of the region, and has been procure a lot of new weapon systems. But then how you deploy those weapon systems, depending on the circumstance, how you fight a conventional war, would be quite interesting. In the South Asia, China-India border, or India-Pakistan, I don't think you can have all these major battle tanks or all these heavy kind of equipment. It's just not viable in terms of logistics and all the rest considerations. In the South China Sea, it will be different kind of conventional engagement, even below the conventional, is like gray zone operations, just below the threshold of direct military conflict.
I think, North Korea and Taiwan are two places we need to pay attention to. There is a very low prospect of major power coordination or cooperation to jointly contain North Korea's nuclear program. And the resulting regional arms race is going to be picking up. And we don't have a ready solution for that. And on Taiwan, I do believe the Ukraine war is making China reflect on some of its previous assumptions about a hypothetical military scenario over Taiwan Strait. That would reduce the risk of a near-term military conflict in that part of the world. But there is also another risk that China believes that the US efforts to develop stronger ties with Taiwan, including military and defense ties, of high-level official visits to Taiwan, are aimed at gradually eroding Chinese leverage to unify Taiwan in the salami slicing strategy. And that means China at some point needs to stand up to the perceived American aggression and respond very strongly. And if that leads to a military conflict, I think the Chinese sentiment is, then so be it. It is forced upon us. It's not our choice of war. So I fear that type of military conflict happening could, the risk of that could increase in the foreseeable future.
So I alluded to a little bit of this before, but I think that, obviously there are big differences between, land conflict in Ukraine and then more like seizing Taiwan, for example, would look very different militarily. But I think for Japan, for example, what's happened in Ukraine has really underscored the importance of self-defense. I think the efforts of Ukrainians on their own behalf have been very striking to the Japanese people, to the Japanese government. I think that's really feeding into these discussions about, Japan's self-defense spending, for example, and other things. Again, I don't think you would expect to see dramatic change, but I think it will probably bump Japan a little bit faster along the incremental path that it has been pursuing, and it will probably give much more concrete impetus to discussions about contingency planning, which have been slow for a long time. So it will probably, accelerate all of those things. I think another thing that we're seeing, for example, in a Taiwan contingency, many people look to the US-Japan alliance as, one of the key responders to that situation. But Japan has constraints. The US has also, different kinds of constraints. And I think that in these conversations, there's more conversation about how there would need to be a global response to this kind of a contingency and how can they broaden out the responses to include others, maybe not militarily, but economically, like what would this look like? And so I think that, there's a bit broader lens on that because of this conflict and just thinking about how it's playing out. For example, NATO being the corollary of the US-Japan alliance. These are very, very different things. And I think the differences are appreciated, but they're also spurring some conversations about what might be necessary in a Indo-Pacific version of this military conflict.
Great, thanks very much. I think it's been very fascinating discussion. It's all the time we have for today because it's now 1 p.m. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to both give your opinions and your expertise as well as listen to us. And I guess, James, I'll hand it over to you to finish off.
Yeah, I just wanted to similarly thank you all, but also, to just recognize that the great force multiplier for the Ukraine-Russian war has some lessons for us, and that was world opinion. The ability to use, information technology, social media, et cetera, to mobilize, not just simply arms or sanctions or the economic force of nation states, but people power was pretty important in this ability for defying the experts in preventing Kiev from being taken, but also for rolling back the Russian forces. So I just want to put that on the table because also it's something we're going to explore further next week, or not next week, but at our next global forum, which will be our third, and it'll be led by Aim Sin-Peng, who's our research program lead of info security. And she's going to be looking at the question of information operations and foreign interference in the Asia-Pacific. And again, lessons potentially to be learned. And so please join us for the next Global Forum, May 17th, same time, noon. And I want to thank Justin for putting together this one. And thank all of you. It's great to have this type of regional expertise and specificity, but also that ability to pull back and, do this kind of lessons learned that we're all hoping will come out of this. So thank you once again. And thank you all for the people who joined us. And please come back again. With that, I'm going to say over and out and enjoy the rest of your day and evening, wherever you might be.
Thanks very much.